Hi, I'm Mike Keys. I know this is an Irish tenor banjo blog, and this is a 5-string banjo, but this is actually the second banjo I ever played. I played tenor banjo first and then 5-string, and there's a reason for this. This is a Recording King RK-R35 banjo. It retails for around $900, and it's the basis for, I think, a really good Irish tenor banjo. What I'm going to do in this video is show you how to take this banjo, which you can get on eBay for around $600, and turn it into a superb Irish tenor banjo with very little work, with the exception of trying to set the neck properly. What you get with this banjo is the entire, everything you need to put another banjo together, with the exception of the neck, which you can get for around $70 to $80. And you also get a case. In the past, I've tried to put these banjos together from RK parts, but it costs more than that just to get the parts, and that's not counting all the drilling and staining and finishing, lining, and everything else that's necessary to put a good banjo together. In addition, you get a very nice 5-string case that'll fit your tenor banjo without any problem. Just put a little bit of stuffing at the headstock end just to protect the headstock, and you're good to go. Hi. Well, when I chose to build a cheaper banjo, but one that's at a professional level, I did it for the reason that I have a couple of friends who were banjo teachers whose students were not really able to afford excellent super banjos like the Epiphone A's, certainly not the Clarine or some of the other Ohm or some of the other high-end banjos, which are really wonderful banjos. But when I've always had 5-string banjos that were master tones, and after I got used to messing around with them, it turns out they're actually fairly simply made. There are two main reasons why I chose the Gibson pattern, which was first designed in 1927 or so, and is basically the basis for all modern banjo makers, with a few exceptions these days. One is that the parts are everywhere. You can get the parts at all levels of cost, and they're all pretty much standardized for an 11-inch pot. And secondly, the tenor necks are available. Now, this particular banjo is based on the Gibson design of around 1935. It has what's called a One Piece Flange, and this flange is butted up against the wood, and it holds the hooks and then in turn holds the tension ring and then the head on. And then it has what's called a coordinator rod system. Now, this may look like it's fairly sophisticated, but it really isn't. All they're doing is they're screwing the neck on with this nut here, and this rod here is actually a nut, giant nut. It holds the neck on, and then these rods go back here to stabilize the system. This bottom rod also holds the tailpiece on, and it's all the way through and through. The top rod, it only goes partially through, and then it's abutted against the rim of this thing with this particular nut here. Now, there are all sorts of, when you first see this system, it's really kind of screwy because it's got all these adjustments and things, but basically all you're doing is holding the neck on. So what you can do is you can get an old neck from the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, if you can find a 1960s tenor neck that will fit this one-piece flange. And I'll have an old neck here. This is a neck that's called a TB00 neck, made around 1937 or so. It is the cheapest neck made, cheapest banjo made by Gibson at the time, but it's been cut out for this one-piece flange. So if I put in the lag bolts that come out here, I haven't put them in yet, then it'll just fit right in like this. You screw it all back together, and you've got yourself a tenor banjo. And I've done this with a couple of different kinds of necks. This particular neck was made during the jazz guitar era, early jazz guitar era, and they're really slick necks. They're very nice necks. And by the way, they're made from the same wood as the very fancy ones. They just have a slight flaw in them, such as a knot or a piece of hardwood showing. And so they did this business with the dark here, light here, dark here, which is considered now a very positive type of finish. But it's an excellent neck. It's got a Brazilian rosewood fretboard. It's got nice big frets. There's not a nut here, but I'll put a nut in, and you'll notice that the tuners are not there either. One thing about these holes here, these holes are much smaller than the standard tuners nowadays. You would have to ream out a 3/8 inch hole, and I'll show you how to do that later. Hi, this is one of the banjos I've made. I got this neck originally from Redunzio, and it came with the original tuners on it, so I didn't have to put a new set of tuners on. This is a mahogany neck. It's from an RB 100, which means it has no binding, which is actually better because they're easier to refret. The mahogany neck makes the sound a little bit more mellow. This is an excellent piece of mahogany. It's over 50 years old. This is furniture grade Honduras mahogany, which you can't even get anymore. This was a fairly easy fit. I had to shim the neck just slightly, and I use pieces of walnut veneer for that, and then just to fit it to the and then make sure that it has a adequate clearance with the strings here. Also, you have to enlarge the fret. I mean the string slots here, which is kind of a separate, little tricky job. It's probably the trickiest thing you have to do, and you can always get somebody to do it for about 20 bucks at a guitar store, because this is a standard setup procedure. But once everything is screwed together, everything's tight, and then you set up the banjo, which I'll show you a little later. It really is a nice sounding, easy playing banjo. Now the nice thing about all these necks, for example, is that they all have truss rods, and this one has the truss rod cover on it. You take the cover off, and it's a standard nut that you can flex the neck as you need it. Again, if you're frightened about all these things, don't bother to worry about it. Somebody else will help you set it up later. Okay, hi. This is a quick and dirty way of how to take one of these banjos apart. Now, this is the 5-string Recording King banjo. It comes with Chinese tuners, which are not the best in the world, but they're adequate. It comes with actually a fairly good 5th-string tuner, which you won't be using. It comes with a very almost inadequate tailpiece, and each one I've seen so far, the cover's just fallen off. These are not good tailpieces. I would spend $16 or $17 and get a Waverly from Elderly Instruments or one of the other places and replace it. But for right now, we're going to just use this. It does come with all the hardware, including the armrest. These are actually it's a very good rim, which is made from maple. These are Saga parts here that are really quite good. The neck is actually a nice 5-string neck. I would hang on to it in case you ever want to learn how to play the 5-string banjo. And everything else is just top quality. But like all Chinese banjos I've ever seen, the tuners and the tailpieces are where they save the money. So first thing you do is you take it apart. You take the strings off. Now, since I'm not going to play this as a 5-string, I'm just going to do this just in a spectacular manner, just so there's no reason to do it this way. You can unwind it, but it just takes a lot less time to do this way. And then I'll turn it over, and you can see how it's put together. Now, here's how to take the 5-string neck off. These coordinator rods are basically there. The top one is there just for stability. It holds the tailpiece on. You have to loosen this first, and I use the 7/16 inch wrench, which you can get almost anywhere. You loosen that because you have to push this back, and then you loosen the lower one for the same reason. Now, I've partially unscrewed this just to save a little time, but these come out like this. comes down off like this. Then you take a hex wrench like this, which I found is a wonderful tool to unscrew with. And then I've also gotten this finger tight or loosened. And this you do it in this order, mainly because it's just physically easier to do it that way. And you'll find that a pin punch, but the thing I like about the hex wrench is it's got an L-shaped thing here, so that when it almost invariably gets to the point where you can't reach the hole directly, so you have to use the L-shaped part here. Let's see, this should no. And because you're giving enough room here, the neck comes off. Now there's two washers here, and this is very important because this will cause problems if you don't put the washers back on. This is a washer with a flat end and a convex end. The flat end goes against the rim. So then what you've done is you've taken the neck off and you put it in a safe place. I've got a 1950s RB100 neck. Now, back in the 50s, they made these out of both maple and mahogany. The one on this bench is mahogany. This one happens to be maple. But both of these pieces of wood are over 50 years of age. And it really makes a big difference because this is really good wood. This, again, is a Brazilian rosewood fretboard. It's got nice, this one has well-preserved frets, a bone nut. And we're going to put it back on the banjo, and I'll show you how to put these things back on again. So what I'm going to do is put this neck on. Just make sure that when you start out, you put the neck on right side up. Sometimes people put them on backwards. It actually can't be done because of the anatomy of these instruments. But this is the tenor neck that I just showed you, and I'm going to put it in like this. And then we're going to take these washers. Remember these washers. Put the flat side against the rim, and you start with the bottom rod, and you're going to have to lift it a little bit like this, jiggle it, but always start with the bottom rod because otherwise you'll have to start all over again because you'll see quickly. Then you take the top rod, screw it in like this. The bottom rod goes all the way to finger tight and then slightly more. It doesn't have to be much more because you're probably going to adjust it anyway when you set it up a little bit. So here's that issue where it really is nice to have this L shape, and that's tight but not super tight. These go on here the same way, and these Chinese threads are a little tight, and I didn't put the soap on that I mentioned it because that makes it easier. But I'm just going to use my 7/16 wrench to put her tight against the washer. Okay, well there was mistake number one, and this is a very common mistake. I forgot to put the little washer on. I've done things like put them on the wrong side, etc. But you'll find that you'll very commonly make this mistake. I'm putting the washer on with the flat side towards the rim. I put a little bit of soap on the thread just to make it slicker, and I am screwing this on. Now the bottom one, this is the bottom coordinator rod. The other coordinator rod is already finger tight plus, and so because it's a little easier to do it this way, I'm just going to screw it on with the wrench. But we'll get that where it needs to go. And as you can see, it's going on pretty readily just because I greased it up with a little bit of soap. You can use paraffin wax. All right, now I'm snugging it up, but I'm not using Gorilla Grip to put it in. There we go. And that's all you need to put the neck on. The neck is now on solidly. That's all you really would need. You don't need these coordinator rods. But they do make a difference in the way that the tone is, and they do make a big difference in the stability of the rim. So it turns out this is a pretty good system this way. So I snug these up here, and the reason you have to have two of these is that there's a nut here on the other side that that needs to be snugged up. Let me show you something about this lower coordinator rod. It doesn't really need to be there, as I pointed out before, but you really should make sure that you tighten this up without this being screwed in. Now then you take it and screw it in like this, and the main issue here has to do with the tailpiece, because this is what holds the tailpiece on. So you go in enough until the tailpiece is cleared. The tailpiece bracket acts as a nut, so you don't really need a nut on that side, but you'll notice there is a similar nut on this side to the one that's the coordinator rod that the nut holding it here has. You simply snug that up here, put the other nut on the other side if you haven't already put it on. I hope you can see that, but it's pretty obvious when you look at it. Square up the bracket and make sure that it's not interfering with the tailpiece. If it is, you just simply screw it in a little more, and then tighten that a little bit using two wrenches. This is why you have to get two of them. They're not very expensive. And you just snug them up, and that's it. You have what's called neutral rods. And everything works out. It's working fine. So this neck is solidly attached. It's attached solidly here, and there's another spot up here where it's attached, and then you're ready to set up your banjo. Now I got these necks from First Quality in Louisville. FQMS.com, I believe, is their website. And this is the Sullivans. Currently, Eric Sullivan is the person, my contact person. And over the years, they've converted a lot of tenor banjos to 5-string banjos, and then they've taken the necks off. And most of the time, the owners decided not to keep the neck, so they had a whole basement full of these. And I bought the cheapest necks they had, just because, frankly, because they were cheap. But you can get them at all levels, and some really wonderful looking necks if you ever wanted to get a fancy banjo or make one yourself. But every one of these Gibson necks will fit, for the One Piece Flange, will fit this Recording King banjo. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't necessarily give you the right neck angle. And this is the tricky part of this. This and drilling the holes for the tuners, the two trickiest parts. Now what I'll do is I'll string this up with a set of standard tenor banjo strings, because this nut here is set up for standard, which are like 30 to 9, and then they're not wide enough for Irish tenor banjo strings, GDAE. Later on, after I string it up and make sure the neck angle's right, I will take nut files and very carefully get these out. What I suggest you do is just go to a luthier and have them do it. It's probably going to cost 20 bucks at most, unless you're handy and have the tools, which are a little bit expensive. It's better to have someone else do it for you. Now you have to make sure everything's tight, and this is, and then you have to learn to set up the banjo. So the first thing that's always wrong with any banjo that comes to you, no matter how well it was set up at the luthier that sent it to you, is that the head is not tight. So you have to learn how to tighten the head, and that's the first thing we're going to show you next. All right, remember, every head is probably not very tight. See, I can shove this down here, and there's a couple of ways to determine head tightness. You can use something called a dial-a-drum. which is a tool that drummers use to determine the tightness of their heads. And what you do is you tighten it until you like the sound, and then you measure it, and you write it down on the inside here, so that when you have to go back again, which you always have to do because banjos are vibrating machines that unloosen everything in them, and there's 100 parts in here, then you go right back to where you were and you'll be fine. But there's two ways of tightening the head. The first thing you have to do is make sure that the tension ring itself is even on the head, because if you don't, you'll warp not only warp the tension ring, but you'll warp the rim, and you'll ruin your banjo. So that being said, you probably never want to touch it again in your life. But it's actually not that hard. Once you've gotten that even, you've checked that it's even, and most of the time it is, then you can get a key. I like to use ratchet wrenches just because they're handier, and I can switch them out for other types of banjos. But this happens to be a 1/4 inch socket, and it fits right here in this Gibson parts. And this is the other part about the standardization of all these parts. Everybody uses these Gibson parts these days, and you just crank it like 1/8 of a crank until it feels a certain amount of tension, and you just go around. I go around like this, and because I'm doing so little with it, and you can do this by feel after you practice it a while, then you just do it, continue to do it all the way around. And there are 24 of these brackets. Now the nice thing about Gibson banjos is that there's a lot known about these banjos and banjo setup. And there's several ways to determine if you've got the right head tension. Now the best way to do it is just to play it, and if you like the sound, that's what it is. But some people like to go like this. About 1 inch from the tension ring, make sure that the sound is pretty much the same note. Now if you can tell me what that note is, you're a genius, because I can't. But there are people who claim they can tell what it is, and they like to tighten it up to a G or a G sharp. I don't bother with that. I just make sure that it's even all the way around. The dial-a-drum is probably a much more accurate way of doing things. But as you can see, this is pretty tight now. It's much tighter than it was before, even though I only went maybe at most an eighth of a turn with each one. There was one hook there that was real loose, so I put it back there till I felt the tension. There's another tool called the Neary wrench, which goes by tension. It's not anywhere near as accurate as the dial-a-drum because of rust and all sorts of other things can cause differences in tension. But right now I'm satisfied with this, and I'll set the banjo up to make a good sound later on. So the next thing to do is to take the tuners off of this Recording King banjo's headstock. Since this is a Chinese-made instrument, these are Chinese tuners, and they tend to be, let's say, barely adequate. Sometimes they're really good. Like a lot of Chinese products, it depends on which factory it's made in. Now, since this is not an American-made tuner, then you have to get an 11mm socket wrench, and I always get the deep ones, to take it off, take the nut off, and it's a simple matter of just unscrewing the nut, and there's two parts here. There's a washer, and then there's a bolt. That's the bolt, and a washer, and then once you take the washer out, don't lose the washer because it's very important. I'm going to put that over here. And then just take your finger, push it out, and you have the tuner out. Now, one important thing about these tuners, and all these tuners have the same thing, there's a little indexing pin right here. I don't know if you can see it, but that has to go into a little tiny hole that you can make with either a small drill or a punch, or sometimes with quality tuners like the Gotos, which are the Go-To tuners. You have a pun here. They cost about $82 a set from Smacula.com, and they're probably the best tuners there are, certainly for the price. You can screw them in and they will make their own hole, but I always make a little tiny hole to index with, and that way they don't turn when you try to set them into the headstock. All right, now here's how these tuners are very simple to put in. There's a 3/8 inch hole, which is pretty much the size, the diameter of these things, and you place it in there so that the little indexing pins and the tiny holes in the back. This particular banjo already had similar tuners on, so the hole is already there. You put the washer on. You put the nut on like this. Just screw it in until it goes all the way. Now and some of these headstocks are not quite as thick as this one, and what happens is that it reaches the end of the this is my 11mm socket. Now see, it's reached the end of it, so that's not going to work. So, is there a trick? Yes, there is. Now the cheap tuner for these banjos won't go all the way down because this headstock is not thick enough to help deal with it. The Chinese banjo headstock is much thicker. Now a Goto tuner would not have this problem, I might add. That's why I like Gotos. But since you want to do this on the cheap, what I've done is I found a 5/16 washer. I painted it black with a magic marker so it won't show up as much. Put it underneath here. Simply screw it back on. And I've added enough space here that I can tighten it up with my 11mm socket wrench, and it's tight in there. Now it's not the prettiest solution, but it is the one that works. Okay, well that's not everything about setting up a banjo and switching over from a 5-string to a tenor banjo, but that's the majority of it. What we have left is how to set up the neck to make sure that you have the right neck angle, and I'll show you that in a later video. And another thing I will do is show you how to remount these smaller holes on these older banjo necks. It's really a very simple process, but everyone's quite afraid of it initially until they do a couple of them, and then it becomes very straightforward. Thanks for looking at this video. If you have any questions, please add the comments to the blog, and I'll be glad to answer them.